Hey, how are you absolute babes doing today? So we're back again and we're talking today about um, how rule breaking collapses global norms. And it's particularly prevalent because of what was happening just in the last couple of weeks with Donald Trump's threat to invade Greenland. So in the last two videos, I was talking about the conditions that precede political breakdown and how authoritarianism actually takes hold. So it takes hold often quietly, procedurally, and usually with public consent. So in this video, I want to widen the lens a little bit because something deeper is happening right now, something many people feel instinctively, but we're struggling to name. So the world feels less restrained, it feels chaotic, it feels less predictable, it feels more dangerous. We're constantly faced with this fear of being confronted with the possibility of World War III. And this isn't just about individual conflicts or bad actors. It's about the collapse of global norms. It's those informal rules that once kept power in check, even when formal law failed. So we often imagine international politics as governed by treaties, laws and institutions, and the way that the NATO alliance is under threat at the minute suggests that perhaps those institutions are a little bit more fragile than we once thought. But in reality, so global order has always depended far more on those kind of unwritten rules, these kind of collaborative agreements, these verbal agreements between governments. So these include these agreements to mutually be restrained on international politics. It's agreements to be predictable. It's agreements to uphold reputation. It's an agreement to be reciprocal in the way that we treat one another internationally. And it's the fear of shame and the loss of legitimacy that uphold those kinds of verbal agreements. So international law, it only works when powerful states choose to be bound by it. So for decades after World War II, global stability rested on this kind of fragile understanding that restraint was in everybody's interest in the long term, and it wasn't in anybody's interest to sort of dive into some sort of global conflict again and for millions of lives to be lost. And that was upheld even when it wasn't convenient. So what we're witnessing now is the erosion of that shared trust and understanding. So when norms break down, there's three things that happen very quickly. And the first one is that violations become precedents. One actor breaks a rule without consequence, and the actions that follow are that everybody thinks that that's a legitimate action. If one's breaking a rule, everybody can. I think the potential consequences of that, so Donald Trump's actions are clearly in violation of international treaties, and that gives a free rein for everybody to think, right, so if they can invade another country without consequences, so can I. And that's the threat, that we've got China and we've got Russia with the potential to invade other countries. Equally, anybody else that elects a charismatic and charming fascist potentially can do the same. So second, moral language becomes instrumental. Rules are invoked selectively. They're applied to enemies and ignored by allies. So we've seen that with conflicts all over the world. So one rule that's broken that potentially is offensive to certain Western powers, and it involves usually white-skinned populations, is more threatening to Western values than all of the continuing wars that are happening in Africa or in the Middle East with brown-skinned populaces being the ones that are victimized equally. So the third reason is that civilians become expendable because restraint is no longer reputationally rewarded. So exactly what we're seeing with these ICE raids in America. And there was 2 poor people that were shot for protesting peacefully. They were clearly murdered, and we've all seen the videos to prove that. These civilians are expendable, and equally the civilians that are being slaughtered in this horrific genocide in Palestine. These civilians are expendable to the long-term goals and narratives of the supposed democracies that are supposed to be fighting for the right causes. So this is why the world suddenly feels more brutal, not because humans have changed, but because the constraints on power have weakened. And crucially, once these norms collapse, rebuilding them is going to be far harder than breaking them. So we're going to be stuck in this for the long haul now, this constant and perpetual state of fear of the state of the world. So this collapse of these norms, it doesn't begin internationally, it begins domestically. So when states are internally polarized, this thing that I've been talking about in the previous videos, is this polarization and the fear that causes all of this. Leaders in these situations, they prioritize short-term survival. How are they going to keep the electorate happy in the short term? And how are they going to keep themselves in power? So long term, this reduces the credibility, their credibility and the country's credibility on the global scale. And that credibility in the long term eventually becomes irrelevant. Foreign policy becomes incoherent. We only need to look at that. Most of what Trump says on a regular basis is just a load of tosh. It doesn't make any sense half of the time. And the way that they're approaching foreign policy is increasingly acts of they create this kind of bemusement across the world. And then eventually institutions lose their authority. So domestic instability, it spills outward. And this is why this global disorder is accelerating at the same time as these other things, such as inequality and increasing polarization and this democratic backsliding towards autocracies. And the breakdown that you feel globally is rooted in the conditions that we discussed in that first video. So finally then, global order, it doesn't collapse because treaties fail. It collapses because restraint no longer feels worth the cost. And when power stops believing it needs legitimacy, the rules become optional. So in the next video, I want to confront one of the most uncomfortable aspects of this moment that we're in. We're in right now a stage in global relations that's going to be part of history books. So in the next video, I want to confront it and what happens when the states that once acted as stabilizers stop playing by the rules themselves.